it's a time-consuming process and not a difficult process, but there's a few places that you can go wrong. So I want to make sure that I highlight those for you so you don't make those mistakes. We're going to focus on the 12-inch radius right now, and then Alex is going to talk to you about some of the finish and cleaning up that you're going to do on the back of the neck. Don't worry about the glue and all of that that's spilling out right now. We'll get that radius on there, and then we'll worry about getting the back of the neck. So the first thing that we need to do when we're getting ready to sand that radius is we need to make sure that this fretboard is perfectly flat. Okay, perfectly flat. And a way to check that is to use this straight edge here and set it on the fretboard, making sure that you're not over the top of any of those fret dots that might be sticking out, right? And kind of looking at that and seeing if you can see any light through that straight edge. And this one is in really good shape, okay? So it is flat. I can see just a couple of spots of light, but I'm not seeing any major areas. What you would typically see is if you're sitting this thing down here, is you would see if the neck is cupped this way, right, concave, then you would see some light underneath in this area, and it's pretty obvious when that happens. The other thing that might happen is when you set this thing down, you're going to see light at both ends here, right? So it's a convex arch on the top of the neck. So and this one here is in pretty good shape, but yours may not be. Okay, so what do we do if it's not flat? Do we start over?
Throw it away.
Throw it away and start over? No. We have a truss rod that's going to be installed into the neck. And this particular truss rod right here, I've taken the plastic sleeving off of it so that you can see how it operates. But normally the plastic sleeve would be left on. But the truss rod is installed in the neck, flat side up. So there's a flat side and a curved side. So we want the curved side toward the neck and the flat side toward the fretboard. And so it would be installed just like that, okay? And then we will use this wrench here to be able to adjust the truss rod to take out the convex or concave nature of your particular neck. And I would expect more often than not there's going to be a slight amount of adjustment needed. So the way this truss rod works here is I'm going to go ahead and put it in this vise as if it's stuck inside. By the way, this is rectangular right here, so it won't turn inside the neck. So I'm going to set that there. And if I adjust this truss rod now, and I turn clockwise, notice what's happening there.
Yeah.
Right? So what it's doing here is it's lifting the middle. Right? So it's lifting the middle, and so if you have a situation where you've got a concavity on that fretboard, then what you want to do is you want to turn clockwise, and that'll raise up the middle and take that out. You know, wood is a natural product; it's going to change quite a bit. So if you have the opposite, this is a dual action truss rod. So if I turn it in a counterclockwise direction, you can see what it does there, right? So that's how that thing works. And I'd encourage you with your students, if you can sacrifice one of these truss rods, take the sleeve off so that they can actually see what's going on inside. It's kind of useful. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you need to raise the middle, right, it's clockwise. If you need to lower the middle, right, bring it down counterclockwise. Okay, so it's a good way to kind of remember that. So in this case, I really don't need to do anything at all. But if I did, then what I would do is I would make the adjustment, maybe about a quarter of a turn, not very much, about a quarter of a turn, and then I would check it again. And if I still have that problem, another quarter turn, and I'll check it again, another quarter turn until it gets there. If it's way out, if anybody sees a situation where you've done maybe a half to 3/4 of a full turn and it's still not kind of coming into compliance, let one of us know here because what happens is on these truss rods, they're kind of good for a certain amount of adjustment, but there's little welds right here and here, and those welds have been kind of ground flat so that they're not in the way, but sometimes they grind a little bit too much and it makes it weak, and so if you torque too much on that, these little welds break, right? So in that situation, just to kind of give you a heads up on that, if, for instance, you needed to take out a large convex situation there, then what I would do is I would have somebody right here kind of push down right here while you're turning that. And that takes the stress off of the truss rod. And then kind of the opposite you'd have to put it, or you could put a couple of blocks right there too if you can't get enough, right? And clamp it as well. So if you can take the load off of the truss rod as you're turning it, it's the torquing action that kind of breaks the weld. It's once it's in position, it's going to be fine, but getting it to position is sometimes trouble, right? So just something to think about. It may not ever be a problem, but when you've helped as many people build guitars as I have, eventually you run into these little situations. Okay, so in this case, I don't need to make any adjustment. If you want to just store your truss rod, even if you don't need to make an adjustment, you can just give it a slight little twist there, and it'll hold it in place, and then it won't fall out and bang around on the floor. Okay, so that's our first step. Okay. Make sure it's flat. Make sure it's flat. And when you're checking flatness, be sure you're not on top of one of these little fret dots that's going to give you a false reading. So the next step is we need to put one of these sanding beams. These sanding beams have a 12-inch radius, and they're sticky back sandpaper. That's part of the kind of the sandpaper kit that you saw on the storefront at guitarbuilding.org. I generally like to put mine up in one of these vices because it's up a little bit higher, but you can choose different adjustments based on your respective height. So clamp that up there, and we're going to start sanding. Okay, so you really got to kind of put your body into this thing in order to really start making some cuts. This is 120 grit sandpaper that's on here right now. So when you're doing this, really get into it, right? This is your aerobic workout for today, right? And as I'm doing that, so as you're doing this, even when you're doing the proper technique here, you're naturally going to be pressing more firmly on one side than the other. It's not going to be a natural balance, and you might start drifting off to one side or drifting off to another. And so what that's going to do is it's going to change the position of the radius, right, on the board. It'll still be 12 inches. It just won't be 12 inches centered on the fretboard. So what we have to do is kind of keep track of, I'm centered on the sandpaper here nicely, and then after I take a few strokes, I'm going to turn it around. Okay, and by turning it around, what I'm doing is I'm averaging out any of the favoritism that I have on one end or the other as I'm doing this, and I'm using my whole body so I don't make my arms super sore. Right, your leg muscles are the stronger muscles, so use those. And we're just doing that until we have a 12-inch radius. Well, how do we know that we have a 12-inch radius? Right? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can look at it on the ends here, and you can kind of see that radius start to happen. And while I'm saying that, I want you to note that these distances, these little thicknesses here and here, should remain the same. If you're cutting evenly, right, that radius is going to cause these edges to shrink by the same amount on this side and this side. So it's a good indicator if you're sanding along, and after a while you take a look and you notice one side is getting shorter faster, right? That means, oh, you're going to have to maybe focus more of your weight on the side that isn't cutting as much, right? So, and you can do that early, but you can't do that late. Once the wood is gone, the wood is gone, right? So what you want to do is kind of keep an eye on those. Look at those. Yep, it looks like it's still even, and keep going. And then flip sides and keep going. Every now and then, brush off the sandpaper as the resins in the wood start to accumulate and fill up the pores of the sandpaper. So we're doing that. We also have these gum sticks that are useful for cleaning off the sandpaper. See, it's as good as new again, right there, ready to go, and I keep going. So it's a fairly long process. Once you think you got that 12-inch radius, and one of the ways that I can tell that I got a 12-inch radius is when I've sanded these center fret dots down to the wood, right? Because that's the last place that's going to get sanded, are those little fret dots, because they're at the crown of the radius. So once those have been sanded and I can see, yeah, that looks pretty good, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some chalk on here, right? And kind of cover some chalk there, and then sand a few times, and if the chalk is all gone, we're good. Okay? If there's still chalk there, you get to keep sanding, right? Once you've achieved that 12-inch radius and you've tested it with the chalk and it's all good, then we have a couple of sanding beams.
Yeah, there's two back
My
here.
lovely assistant will show you there.
They have blue painter's tape on them. They have fine paper on them.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
and so a few strokes with the fine paper just to clean out any scratches or such that might be in there. Okay, and then you're pretty good with that. There's a compressed air tank over there on the other side of where Michelle was, and you can use that to blow out the frets, get all the sawdust out of the frets there, because they'll accumulate, and we'll definitely want to get those cleaned out before we go much further. But you still have a whole lot of work to do on the other side, right? So that's important. Also, if you notice that you're starting to lose the height of the nut slot unevenly, right? If it's starting to wear down on one side more than the other, that's another indication that you're pushing on one side more than the other, and you might have to compensate, right? And remember, when you compensate, when it's this direction, I may be compensating that way. When I come over here, now I have to compensate that way, right? So keeping track of that as you're going along. Okay. The last thing that we'll typically do at this junction, as far as the fretboard is concerned, is the little fret dots are going to be really scratched up. Okay. They're not going to look very good. They're going to look pretty dull from the sandpaper. So we've got just some little razor blades, and I don't think I have them out yet, but I'll get some little razor blades, and you can just use the razor blade like a scraper and just scrape across that fret dot, and it'll just be shiny black again, or shiny white if you're using the white ones, right? So so just a little scrape on those, and those will clean up those fret dots, and they'll look great. All right. So pretty comfortable on the steps, right? Flatten, sand, alternate. Check often, check often, check often, check often. When you got that 12-inch radius, you've checked it with the chalk, and go to the fine sandpaper and clean it up after that. Okay?